Bulldog is the third episode of Series 4 of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. It was directed by David Mitten, produced by Britt Allcroft, composed by Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell, narrated in the UK by Michael Angelis, and in the US by George Carlin. It was based on the story of the same name from the 25th book of the Railway series, Duke the Lost Engine, written by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry and published in 1970, with illustrations by Gunvor and Peter Edwards, who illustrated for the Railway series from 1963 with Stepney the Bluebell engine to 1972 with Tramway engines, the very last book to be written by Wilbert Awdry before his son Christopher Awdry took over in 1983 with Really Useful engines. It was first released in 1994 straight to VHS in the UK, along with other Series 4 episodes on the VHS Rock and Roll and Other Stories, before being broadcast on TV in 1995, before waiting a year to be released in America in 1996. Like many of the stories picked from the Railway series, quite a few changes were made bringing Bulldog to TV. Some good, others, not so much. To give an example, in the book, the story was told by Peter Sam and Sir Handel to the rest of the Little Engines, brought up with a continuing plot point from a previous book with Skarloey and Rheneas' 100th birthday. Because that story was never chosen to be adapted for TV, Britt and the rest of the production crew had to change the opening and instead have Thomas tell the story to the rest of the big engines. A change I actually prefer because it allows for a scene where the engines are all just dozing early in the morning before work starts and just sharing in some great banter, leading to quite a funny moment with Percy and Gordon.
Driver should be here by now. What's he doing?
Sleeping, grunted Gordon.
This is great banter. It really is.
What I don't like about this episode, which is more of a nitpick to the series in general that I mentioned in my Series 4 review, plug, is the change in story order. In the books, both this and You Can't Win are told in between Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty, but here, they're told after both those stories. While it far from affects my love for those 4 stories, hell, Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty are my 2 favourite episodes of Series 4. I think it would have been more interesting to let some time pass between Duke being left in the shed and Duke being found. Would have made for a much more fulfilling rescue in Sleeping Beauty, I believe, as it would have felt more like a long time had passed. But I'm getting off topic here. Bulldog is a beautiful looking episode, showcasing the peak visual style of classic Thomas and Friends with its fuzzy and warm colour palette, enhanced more by the aesthetic of the countryside and the railway line high up in the mountain, capturing that pure quaintness of a realistic British railway, amplified by the phenomenal soundtrack by Mike and Junior, which is a given as they rarely ever let us down, especially with the use of the iconic majesty that is the Skarloey Railway theme. But what it does best of all is tell an incredible lesson for children and adults that you wouldn't expect to see in a show about talking steam engines: the responsibilities of parental figures. The episode plot plays out as such. Percy is impatient and says he'll be late for getting the coaches ready for the other engines, despite it being early in the morning and all the engines are still dozing. So Thomas decides to tell him about not being impatient by sharing a story about Duke on the old narrow gauge railway. The story takes place when Falcon was new to said railway and still learning his way around. The manager tasks him with learning the mountain road and says Duke will show him the line, much to his annoyance. The next day, after Falcon has a new coat of paint, Duke says he'll lead the way, but Falcon is having none of that and says he'll lead instead.
How can I learn the route with you lumbering ahead and blocking the view?
Suit yourself, said Duke.
But never mind the view, look at the track.
Straight away, it's made abundantly clear who's who in this scenario. Falcon represents ignorance, having confidence in his own abilities despite a severe lack of experience that makes him believe he can do anything. A very common trope we saw a lot in the early days of the show with Series 1, with characters like Thomas, James and Gordon, who all three in their own way believed they could make no mistakes. only for the good old fate of life to make them act like fools, humbling them in the process, meaning it's only a matter of time before Falcon experiences the same thing. Duke represents experience. Like Edward, he has the mindset to pass this experience on to others so as not to let them make fools of themselves or take charge of dangerous, difficult jobs that are not for the inexperienced or reckless. He constantly tells Falcon to keep a good lookout on the journey, despite him throwing insults back in his face.
Look at the track, puffed Duke. Never mind the view. Fusspot, fusspot, replied Falcon. Fuddy-duddy, fuddy-duddy, fuddy-duddy.
Duke could very easily just let Falcon do what he wants. But not only is he there for the passengers' safety and helping them reach their destination on time, but also because for Falcon, as well as Stuart in another story, he takes the responsibility of being a father figure to them. Shows like Thomas the Tank Engine couldn't have parent characters even if they wanted to. These characters were not born per se, but rather built in a factory. They are sentient machines, and while they're not brain-dead babies when they're created, they lack parental figures to teach them how to become decent people, or decent engines. One might say, oh, the Fat Controller is the parental figure to the engines, right? Because he looks after them. And while that is kind of true, seeing as he does help them with sending them to the works whenever they need fixing, he's not so much a parent to the engines as he is a boss in the workplace. Only ever stepping in to do things like give them tasks he'd like them to complete, scold them for messing up their jobs in ways that waste time and money, or to praise them for getting something done right. Not to say he doesn't care for his engines, as his compassionate side did show on a couple of occasions, but for the most part he remained an authority figure. So without any human guidance, the engines have to confide in each other for advice. Whichever engine has the most knowledge to pass on, in their own way, becomes parental figures to the others in times when they don't know what to do or need to be told how to do a job without potentially injuring themselves. Which is why on the mainline, engines like Edward can be seen as a father to the mainline engines. See episodes like James and the Coaches, where Edward doubleheads a passenger train with James as he tries to keep him from going too fast, or A Close Shave, where he comforts Duck after he is wrongly accused by Diesel for lying. Or perhaps most prominently, The Deputation, where Edward gives Percy and the others the idea of nominating an engine to speak to the Fat Controller about saving Donald and Douglas from being sent away to scrap. Duke carries that same role to Stuart and Falcon, not only because he's the oldest engine on the railway with the most experience, but because their railway is practically in the middle of nowhere. Their manager is there to look after them for the sake of the railway, but Duke is there to look after them for the sake of keeping them safe. Even if they don't always appreciate it.
Don't dawdle, urged Falcon. No hurry, puffed Duke.
However, one moment is about to solidify Falcon's respect for Duke and showcase just how far Duke is willing to go to keep them from harm. The two engines pass through a tunnel, with Falcon still being impatient and wanting to pass through the tunnel as soon as possible.
One moment everything seems safe, then suddenly...
Falcon derails and nearly goes over the edge of the cliffside of the track, a moment showcased very differently compared to the book's illustrations and is actually one of the rare occasions where the adaptation outdoes the original. While the illustrations have little details like showing the engine sheds at the bottom of the hill, most of the mountainside is left in the background, with the engines, crew and eventually the passengers taking up the foreground, so there's no real way to see how far it is that Falcon will potentially fall down. In the TV series, the set direction and shot composition sells this fear much more effectively. The camera is placed at a low angle, with little details like the sound effects of the eagle, but also the sharpness of the 90-degree drop. If Falcon falls, he isn't gonna roll, he's heading straight down. Duke bravely holds on, reversing backwards to keep Falcon from going over. Considering we only ever see Duke moving around quite slowly, as he's old and doesn't want to strain himself out, to see him spinning his wheels faster than he probably has done in years just to keep Falcon safe should already be clear how much he cares about him and by extension Stuart. He's not reversing that fast so he doesn't fall, but so that Falcon doesn't fall, barking orders at him so he can keep hold of him.
Stop shaking, he called. I can't hold you if you shake.
Not only that, but he also did it without hesitation or panic. Had this been Stuart in this scenario, he most likely would have frozen in shock and Falcon would have fallen down the mountain there and then. But not Duke. He immediately reacts and knows what must be done to keep Falcon safe. It's almost like a parental instinct that just kicks in whenever their child is in danger. As Duke stands his ground, his driver and fireman put chocks behind his wheels and strengthen the couplings, only for the driver to realise Duke is running very low on water. Thankfully, there's a workman's cottage nearby and the passengers lend a helping hand in passing anything that can hold water to be emptied into Duke's tank. I enjoy how involved the passengers get with saving Falcon. Oftentimes when an accident occurs, the passengers are written as just people who sit in the coaches complaining that their train is late. However, this is not an instance of a train being delayed, someone's life is at risk. So, they play an active role in doing what they can together to help out the engines without complaint. And thus, because of their help, Duke is able to pull Falcon away from the cliff and back onto the tracks. They complete their journey, the passengers sing Duke's praises to the manager.
He stood firm like a bulldog.
He said it! He said it!
And Falcon and Duke share in a sweet little interaction to close off the episode.
Thank you for saving me, Duke. I don't know why you bothered after I'd been so rude. Oh well, replied Duke. You just had a new coat of paint. It would have been a pity if you'd have rolled down the mountain and spoilt it.
The point to take away from this episode is, there is a big responsibility to being a parent. Kids try to get away with as much reckless, bad behaviour as possible, just because they think they can. Sometimes they don't know the damage they're doing or the danger they've put themselves in until it's too late. While it is the responsibility of the parent to put those barriers in place and tell the child what not to do, chances are they won't listen. But should their actions lead them into dangerous scenarios, it's also the responsibility of the parents that they do not rest until their child is safe and sound. That is what this episode tells us. Had it been an instance where Falcon just came off the rails on a harmless stretch of track, Duke, his crew and all the passengers would have the right to be annoyed and disappointed in him for making the mistake of not watching where he was going. But because Falcon was in a life-threatening situation, it doesn't matter if he was right or wrong for being careless. What matters is saving his life, regardless of whether he expects it or not. Because to a parent raising their children, while failure is a great teacher, nothing else matters when their child is in danger than to try and save them. So, the important message it carries to either new or old parents or foster and adoptive guardians is this: it's not about being right, but just protecting the child that you love and care for. For a show like Thomas the Tank Engine to tell that message, that is quite the accomplishment to be proud of.